Laura Bennett stood by the kitchen window of her cozy Vermont home, watching the golden leaves dance in the October wind. Her husband, Michael, sat at the table, reading the local paper with his usual calm. Life had been quiet lately, too quiet. Their children were grown and gone, their routines predictable. Some evenings, Laura missed the excitement that used to fill their younger years, the laughter, the unexpected moments, the thrill of something new. That evening, a knock on the door broke the silence. Laura opened it to find a smiling young woman holding a small basket of cookies. "Hi, I'm Sophie Miller. My husband, Evan, and I just moved into the farmhouse across the street." Her voice was bright and friendly. Laura smiled back, pleasantly surprised. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Come in. It's chilly out there." Sophie stepped in, her presence immediately lighting up the room. She was in her late 20s, full of energy, with curious eyes that noticed everything. "Oh, I don't want to intrude," Sophie said. "I just wanted to introduce myself, and maybe invite you both to dinner tomorrow night. Evan and I are still settling in, but we'd love to meet our neighbors." Michael looked up from his paper, his polite smile turning genuine. "That's kind of you. We'd love to." As Sophie left, waving cheerfully, Laura turned to her husband. "She seems lively," Michael chuckled. "That's one way to put it. It might be nice to have new people around. We could use some fresh conversation." The next day came quickly. Laura spent extra time getting ready. She wasn't sure why, but she wanted to look nice. Maybe it was because Sophie seemed so effortlessly put together. Maybe it was just the excitement of something different. When they arrived at the Millers' farmhouse, the air was crisp and scented with pine. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, and soft jazz music drifted into the night. Sophie greeted them with her usual sunshine smile, and Evan followed behind her, a tall, kind-faced man with calm confidence. "Welcome," he said, shaking Michael's hand. "We're so glad you came." Inside, the house was a mix of rustic charm and modern design. The table was set beautifully, candles flickering, a soft glow making everything feel intimate. Laura noticed how naturally Evan and Sophie moved together, finishing each other's sentences, laughing easily. It reminded her of when she and Michael were first married, before life became schedules and routines. Over dinner, the conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about Vermont's quiet beauty, city life, and how both couples had ended up here, searching for peace, for meaning, for something slower. Sophie leaned forward, curious. "So how long have you two been together?" 27 years, Laura said with a proud smile. "We met in college. He was the quiet one in the back row, and I was the one who couldn't stop asking questions." Evan laughed. "And now you've been together longer than we've been alive." Michael grinned. "That makes us sound ancient." Laura glanced at her husband, her heart softening. His hair had turned silver, his shoulders broader with time, but his eyes still held the same gentle steadiness that had drawn her to him years ago. As the night went on, Sophie talked about how she and Evan had met while traveling in Europe. Their story was full of youth and bold choices, and Laura listened with quiet admiration. She felt both happy for them and strangely wistful, remembering the boldness she once had. When dessert came, a homemade apple tart, Evan raised his glass. "To new friendships," he said warmly. They all clinked glasses, and the warmth of the moment filled the room. The laughter that followed felt easy, honest, and full of life. But beneath that ease, Laura felt something deeper, a quiet awareness of time passing. Watching Evan and Sophie reminded her not just of her youth, but of all the small moments she and Michael had lost to routine. There was a flicker of sadness there, but also a spark of hope. After dinner, Sophie suggested they move to the porch for tea. The night air was cool and carried the faint scent of rain. The stars shimmered above the dark trees, and the porch light cast soft shadows across everyone's faces. Laura sat back, sipping her tea, while Sophie asked Michael about his work as a woodworker. "I've seen your shed," Sophie said. "It looks like something out of a magazine." Michael smiled modestly. "It's my little world. Keeps me grounded." Evan leaned forward. "I'd love to see your project sometime. I used to help my dad build things when I was younger." Laura watched the exchange, pleased but also thoughtful. She hadn't seen Michael so animated in a long time. Something about being around this younger couple brought out a lightness in him that she hadn't realized was missing. As the evening grew later, Sophie turned to Laura. "I hope we can be friends. I know there's an age gap, but you two have such calm energy." "It feels comforting," Laura smiled gently. "We'd like that too." When they finally said goodnight, Sophie hugged her tightly, and Evan shook Michael's hand with sincere warmth. "Next time dinner's on us," Michael promised as they walked to their car. Driving home, the road was quiet except for the hum of the engine. Laura looked out at the stars through the windshield, her thoughts tangled between nostalgia and curiosity. "They're different," she said softly. Michael nodded. "They are. But I like them. There's something genuine about both of them," she smiled faintly. "Yes, genuine." When they reached home, Laura lingered by the window, watching the farmhouse lights still glowing across the road. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Alive. Not because of anyone new, but because she remembered that connections, even unexpected ones, could still touch the heart deeply. As she got ready for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her was older, yes, but also wiser, more layered. She smiled to herself. Maybe this new friendship would bring a little color back into their quiet days. Meanwhile, across the street, Sophie and Evan sat on their porch, talking softly about the Bennetts. "They're lovely," Sophie said. "There's something about them that feels steady. I want to learn from that." Evan nodded thoughtfully. "They remind me that love doesn't have to fade. It can just grow quieter." And with that, both couples went to sleep, unaware that the evening they had just shared was the beginning of something far deeper than a simple dinner invitation. That night would stay with them all. An evening of laughter, warmth, and unspoken emotions that would soon lead to a bond none of them had expected. The days after that dinner felt lighter for Laura and Michael. The Bennetts' home, once silent except for the ticking of the old clock and the sound of Michael's tools in the shed, now carried new laughter. Sophie often dropped by unannounced, always with something in her hands. Fresh muffins, a jar of jam, or flowers from her garden. Her visits became small bursts of color in Laura's quiet afternoons. One Friday morning, Sophie appeared at Laura's door, cheeks flushed from the cold, clutching a basket. "You're coming over tonight, right?" she asked, grinning. "Evan's making his famous chili and I won't take no for an answer." Laura smiled. "You're persistent." "That's why people can't say no to me," Sophie replied playfully. 6 o'clock. Don't make me drag you out of the house." When Sophie left, Laura stood for a while, smiling to herself. There was something about Sophie's energy, youthful but warm, that reminded her of how life used to feel when she and Michael were newly married. She wanted to say no, to stay in her comfort zone, but she also wanted to feel that spark again. That evening, she and Michael walked across the road together. The sky was painted pink and gold, the air carrying the smell of firewood and autumn leaves. When Sophie opened the door, the house glowed with candlelight and laughter. Evan was stirring a pot in the kitchen, wearing an apron with the words "Master Chef in Training." "Welcome," he said, waving them in. "You came just in time. Sophie nearly started without you." "Because I was starving," Sophie called from the couch. Laura laughed, feeling instantly at ease. The evening unfolded easily. Stories, shared jokes, and teasing laughter. Evan told them about his new carpentry job, and Michael offered advice. Laura noticed how Evan listened to Michael's every word, almost like a student learning from a mentor. "You've got experience I could only dream of," Evan said sincerely. Michael shook his head. "Experience mostly means a lot of mistakes learned the hard way." Everyone laughed. After dinner, they moved to the living room where the fireplace crackled softly. Sophie turned on some old music from the 80s, songs Laura hadn't heard in years. "Oh, I love this one," Laura exclaimed when time after time started to play. Sophie jumped up. "Then dance with me." Laura hesitated, laughing. "Oh, I haven't danced in years." "That's exactly why you should," Sophie said, taking her hand. Laura gave in, her laughter blending with the rhythm. The simple act of dancing, barefoot in someone else's living room, made her feel young again. When the song ended, she caught Michael watching her with a soft smile. It reminded her of their college days, when he used to watch her across crowded rooms with that same quiet admiration. Later, while Sophie cleared the dishes, Evan joined Michael on the porch. "You two seem really close," Evan said thoughtfully. "It's nice to see a marriage that's lasted this long and still looks real." Michael smiled. "It's real, all right. Not always easy, but real." Inside, Sophie leaned against the counter, watching Laura. "You're lucky, you know," she said softly. "The way he looks at you, it's rare." Laura felt a warmth rise in her chest. "After 27 years, I sometimes forget that. Life gets busy. You start moving in circles instead of forward." Sophie nodded. "Maybe that's why people like us meet, to remind each other what still matters." When the evening ended, they hugged at the door. Sophie held Laura's hands for a moment and said, "You're the kind of woman I hope I'll become someday." The words stayed with Laura long after they walked home. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how connections sometimes arrive when you least expect them. There was something healing about Sophie and Evan, something that stirred the parts of her heart that had been quiet too long. Over the next few weeks, the friendship deepened. The couples shared dinners, walks, and coffee mornings. Sometimes Michael and Evan worked together in the workshop, sanding wood and trading stories. Other times, Laura and Sophie sat on the porch, sipping tea and talking about everything from books to love to growing older. Sophie often spoke about her dreams, traveling, opening her own art studio, maybe starting a family someday. Laura listened with a motherly fondness, but also admiration. There was something refreshing about her openness, her belief that life was still wide and full of possibility. One afternoon, while helping Sophie plant tulip bulbs in her front yard, Laura paused to wipe her hands and looked at the younger woman beside her. "You remind me of who I used to be," she said quietly. Sophie glanced up. "And who is that?" "A woman who believed that love could fix anything," Laura said with a soft smile. "Somewhere along the way, I started believing it was something you just kept alive." Sophie leaned her head on Laura's shoulder for a second. "Maybe both are true," she whispered. That evening, when Laura returned home, she found Michael in his workshop, sanding a chair. "You've been spending a lot of time with them," he said gently. "Is that bad?" He shook his head. "No, I like them. They make things feel different." "Good different," Laura nodded. "I feel that too." As the days shortened and autumn deepened, their small group grew closer. The Bennetts' quiet life began to feel alive again, filled with laughter, shared meals, and the comforting rhythm of companionship. For the first time in years, Laura stopped feeling like life was something that had already happened to her. One evening, Sophie called unexpectedly. "Hey, are you and Michael free tonight?" Laura smiled. "Always. Good," Sophie said, her voice bright. "We have a surprise for you." When Laura hung up, she turned to Michael, curiosity in her eyes. "They're up to something," he smiled knowingly. "Then I guess we'll find out." As they walked down the familiar path toward the Miller's house, the sky was darkening to deep blue, the air cool and full of anticipation. The porch light was on, and soft music floated through the air. Laura had no idea that the night waiting for them would change. More than just their evening, it would shift. Something inside all of them, the laughter and warmth they'd shared so far were only the beginning. What came next would teach them that sometimes love doesn't just belong to youth. It belongs to every age, in every form. If only you're brave enough to feel it again. And as she reached for Michael's hand, walking toward the glowing light of their neighbor's home, Laura realized she hadn't felt this alive in years. She didn't know it yet. But that night, Evan's surprise, Sophie's smile, and the way hearts quietly opened, would become a memory that stayed with her forever. The Miller's farmhouse glowed warmly against the cool night, lanterns flickering softly on the porch as Laura and Michael walked up the path. Inside, they could already hear music, something soft and romantic, the kind that made you slow your pace without realizing it. Sophie opened the door before they even knocked, her face glowing with excitement. "There you are," she said. Come in, come in." "Evan's finishing up the surprise," Laura laughed as Sophie grabbed her hand and pulled her inside. The house smelled of cinnamon and baked apples. On the table were candles, 2 bottles of wine, and plates set for 4. "What's all this?" Laura asked, smiling. Sophie grinned. "You'll see." Evan appeared from the kitchen, holding a covered dish. "I told Sophie you've done enough cooking for us lately," he said warmly. "Tonight's our turn." The Bennetts exchanged amused glances. "You didn't have to do all this," Michael said. "Maybe not," Evan replied. "But we wanted to." Dinner was simple but heartfelt. Roasted chicken, vegetables from their garden, and a pie that Sophie proudly admitted had taken her 3 attempts to get right. The conversation was effortless, filled with laughter and little stories about their lives before moving to Vermont. At one point, Sophie looked at Laura and said softly, "You two are like proof that love can last." "It's comforting to see." Laura smiled, touched. "It's lasted because we've learned to grow with it, even when life tried to shrink it." Evan nodded thoughtfully. "That's the part no one tells you when you're young. You don't just fall in love once. You fall again and again, sometimes with the same person, sometimes with life itself." There was something about his words that made the moment linger. Laura felt it too, that quiet truth about how time reshapes love. After dinner, Sophie disappeared into another room. A few minutes later, she came out holding a small box. "Okay," she said, grinning. "Now for the fun part." Inside the box were folded pieces of paper. "What's this?" Michael asked. "Questions," Sophie said. "It's a game Evan and I play sometimes. It's called 2 Truths and a Wish. Everyone writes 2 true things about themselves and 1 thing they secretly wish for. We have to guess which one's the wish." They all laughed, and soon the room was filled with playful guesses and warm teasing. When it was Laura's turn, she read hers aloud. "I once wanted to be a photographer. I've never spent a night away from Michael. I sometimes wish I could relive one day from my 20s. Sophie guessed the second one was the wish, but Laura shook her head gently. "It's the last one," she said softly. "Not because I don't love where I am now, but because there are moments from back then I'd love to feel again." "Not change, just feel," Evan nodded. "That's a good wish. To remember the version of yourself who still believed in beginnings." When Michael's turn came, he said, 2 truths and a wish. "Okay, I built my first table at 16. I hate flying, and I wish I could give Laura everything she's ever dreamed of." The room grew quiet for a moment. Laura looked at him, her eyes soft with emotion. "You already did," she said simply. The game went on, full of laughter again, but the warmth of that moment stayed like a glow in the air. Later, Evan brought out his guitar, and Sophie dimmed the lights. The living room filled with music, gentle, heartfelt songs that seemed to speak directly to the soul. Laura sat quietly, her hands around a mug of tea, watching Michael relax in a way she hadn't seen in years. She could tell he was enjoying himself, the simple connection, the easy company. When Evan started singing a slow tune, Sophie sat beside Laura and whispered, "Isn't it strange how people cross paths? We almost didn't move here," Laura smiled faintly. "And we almost didn't come to dinner that first night," Sophie nodded. "Funny how little choices change everything." The night grew later, and as the fire burned low, the 4 of them talked about dreams, aging, and what it meant to love through time. There was no pretense between them anymore, just honest words and quiet understanding. When the clock struck 11, Laura stood and said, "We should probably head home." "Not yet," Sophie said quickly. "Just one more thing." She led them outside to the backyard, where Evan had set up a small fire pit. The night sky was clear, and stars shone like diamonds. "I thought we'd end the night with s'mores," Sophie said, laughing. Old-fashioned, but perfect. They sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows, their faces lit by the orange glow. The air was cool, and Laura wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Evan passed her a mug of hot chocolate, and she accepted it with a grateful smile. Michael looked across the flames at the younger couple, his expression thoughtful. "You two remind me that life doesn't end when the kids leave or the years start to stack up. It just changes shape." Sophie leaned her head on Evan's shoulder, "and sometimes it gets better." Laura watched them quietly, her heart full. She realized something then. This friendship wasn't about age or circumstance. It was about recognition. They saw something in each other that reflected both who they were and who they still wanted to be. The conversation faded into comfortable silence as the fire crackled. Laura tilted her head back, staring at the sky. The stars looked close enough to touch, and she suddenly felt a strange peace she hadn't known in a long time. When they finally stood to leave, Sophie hugged her tightly. "This was perfect," she said. "We should do this again soon." "Absolutely," Laura replied, her voice warm. As they walked back across the quiet road, Michael slipped his arm around her. "You look happy," he said softly. "I am," she replied. "I think I forgot what it felt like to really connect with people." "They brought that back somehow." Michael smiled. "They did. And maybe it's something we needed." Laura nodded, her eyes on the glowing farmhouse behind them. "It was an unforgettable night," she whispered. When they reached home, Laura paused on the porch and looked up at the stars one last time. She felt something different inside, hope maybe. Or the realization that love, no matter how old it gets, can still find new ways to feel alive. She didn't know it yet, but that night marked a quiet turning point. In the weeks that followed, the bond between the two couples would deepen into something even more meaningful. Proof that sometimes, life gives you exactly the people you need, right when you need them most. And as she went inside, closing the door gently behind her, Laura couldn't help but smile. That night hadn't just been unforgettable. It had been a reminder that hearts, no matter their age, are always capable of feeling new again. Over the next few weeks, the friendship between the Bennetts and the Millers grew stronger. What started as shared dinners turned into hikes on misty mornings, movie nights with blankets and popcorn, and quiet coffee talks on the porch. Laura and Michael found themselves smiling more, laughing more, and feeling lighter than they had in years. Sophie and Evan brought something fresh into their lives. Youthful energy mixed with genuine warmth. They never treated the Bennetts as the older couple next door. Instead, they saw them as equals, as friends with stories worth hearing. And the Bennetts, in return, saw in them a reflection of who they once were. Hopeful, passionate, still figuring out the rhythm of life. One Sunday afternoon, they all decided to visit a nearby lake. The sky was bright blue, the kind of day that begged people to be outside. Evan had packed a picnic and Sophie brought her camera. Laura wore a sun hat, and Michael carried an old guitar he hadn't touched in years. When they reached the lake, Evan spread out a blanket while Sophie ran toward the water with her camera. "I need to capture this light," she shouted playfully. Laura laughed, watching her. "She reminds me of myself when I used to paint," she said softly. Michael glanced at her. "You used to light up like that," he said. "Maybe you should again." The comment stayed in Laura's mind as the day went on. They spent hours by the water, talking, eating, skipping stones. When the afternoon sun began to sink lower, Michael picked up his guitar and started to play an old tune. It was simple, but it carried something tender. Sophie and Evan stopped to listen. "That's beautiful," Sophie said. "What song is that?" Michael smiled faintly. "Something I wrote a long time ago when we were newly married." Evan grinned. "You never recorded it?" Michael shook his head. "Never thought it was worth keeping." Laura looked at him, her eyes soft. "It was always worth it," she said. That night, back home, Laura couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Michael had said and how easily he dismissed his own gifts. She thought about herself, too. How she'd once dreamed of opening a small art studio. How she used to paint until the colors on her fingers felt like tiny stories. Somewhere along the years, between raising kids and keeping a home, she'd set it aside. The next morning, she went down to the basement and found her old easel. Dust covered it, but the sight of it stirred something inside her. She smiled faintly and carried it upstairs. When Michael saw it later that day, he stopped. "Are you painting again?" She nodded. "I think I want to." He smiled, a slow, proud smile. "Good. About time." Weeks passed, and soon their home began to feel alive again. Laura painted in the afternoons while Michael restored old furniture in his workshop. Sophie often visited, bringing tea and sitting nearby as Laura painted. They'd talk about dreams, about the kind of lives they wanted to build. One day, Sophie admitted quietly, "Evan and I have been thinking about starting a family, but I'm scared we'll lose each other in the process." Laura set down her brush. "You won't," she said gently, "but you'll change. And that's okay. The love that grows through change is the one that lasts." That same night, Evan invited Michael to his workshop. They stayed there for hours, talking about work, life, and what it meant to feel useful. Michael confessed that sometimes he felt invisible now that he was retired. Evan listened, then said, "You're not invisible, Mike. You're just in a quiet chapter, and maybe that's where the best stories are written." The bond between the four deepened. It wasn't just friendship anymore. It was a shared understanding that love, in all its forms, could still surprise you. A few days later, Sophie called with excitement in her voice. "You two have to come over tonight. No excuses." When Laura and Michael arrived, the house looked magical. Candles lined the porch and the living room was softly lit. "What's going on?" Laura asked. Evan smiled. "It's an appreciation night. For both of you." They sat down, and Sophie showed a slideshow of photos. Pictures from the lake, dinners, moments they hadn't even realized were being captured. Between the laughter and the pictures, emotion filled the room. Sophie paused the slideshow on a photo of Laura and Michael sitting side by the fire pit, their faces glowing from the flames. "That one," she said softly. "That's what real love looks like to me." Laura felt tears well in her eyes. Michael reached for her hand under the table. "You two remind us why it was worth believing in love in the first place," Evan said. "This friendship, it's changed us," Laura whispered. "It's changed us too." As the night went on, they shared stories about their pasts, old regrets, missed chances, and small miracles that led them where they were. The honesty in the room was deep and warm. Later, when everyone had fallen quiet, Evan said, "You know what's crazy? We planned to stay here for just a year. Now I can't imagine leaving." Sophie nodded. "This place gave us something we didn't know we needed." Laura smiled. "Sometimes life gives you people when you're ready to remember who you are." The room fell into silence again, the kind that feels comforting, not empty. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows, and the fire crackled. That night, after they got home, Laura and Michael sat on their porch, wrapped in a blanket. The stars were out again, scattered across the dark sky. Michael turned to her. "You know," he said, "I think we both forgot how to live for a while." They reminded us,